The end of World War II marked the close of an unprecedented era of military mobilization. As the Allies celebrated victory in 1945, their victory was tempered by an overwhelming problem: what to do with the vast quantities of war material that had been produced to wage the conflict. Among the most pressing concerns were the aircraft, thousands of which had been manufactured, flown, and discarded in the wake of the war. These planes were both symbols of wartime achievement and emblems of an uncertain post-war future. Now obsolete, surplus, or simply no longer needed, these aircraft were suddenly an economic and logistical burden. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the sheer scale of this surplus became apparent. The United States alone had produced over 300,000 aircraft during the war: fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes, transport planes, and specialized models, many of which had never seen battle. At the war's end, however, the need for such a fleet vanished almost overnight. For the Allies, victory meant peace, but it also meant a dramatic reduction in military demands. The transition from war to peace left many military industries reeling. Production lines were abruptly halted, and the workforce that had once built these aircraft was suddenly faced with the question of what to do next. The first reaction from military authorities was to seek out ways to handle the surplus efficiently. The United States, with its immense stockpile of aircraft, began by placing large numbers of planes into storage. The decision to build and maintain these large stockpiles was not solely driven by immediate operational needs but also by the uncertainty of the future. The Cold War was beginning to take shape, and although the world had just emerged from one catastrophic conflict, another seemed a distinct possibility. These aircraft would act as a buffer, an insurance policy should the global situation rapidly deteriorate. But this reasoning could only justify holding on to so much. At first, many aircraft were relegated to the thousands of temporary storage sites scattered across the United States. These sites, colloquially referred to as aircraft graveyards, were often located in remote, desert regions. The harsh, arid conditions of these sites, such as the Mojave Desert in California and the Arizona Desert, were ideal for the long-term preservation of metal aircraft. The dry climate slowed the corrosion process, and the vast expanses of unused land offered the space to store the planes without immediate costs. However, as the years progressed, the question of what to do with the surplus intensified. The financial cost of maintaining these aircraft was high. To put it in perspective, the U.S. Air Force's maintenance budget alone was strained to the point where they could no longer afford the upkeep of these planes in storage. The planes, once symbols of military strength, had become a drain on resources, some deteriorating while others simply sat idle in the desert sun. By 1947, it became clear that many of the aircraft were never going to be needed. The immediate post-war years were marked by a period of demobilization. The Allies, now looking inward to rebuild their shattered economies, could not afford to maintain a standing army on the scale that the war had required. Aircraft that had once been in high demand were now redundant. Aircraft such as the B-17 Flying Fortress and the P-51 Mustang, once seen as the pinnacle of aviation technology, were left to gather dust, their sleek fuselages and powerful engines now irrelevant to the needs of a peacetime military. As the 1940s turned into the 1950s, the United States and other Allied powers began looking at ways to streamline their armed forces, and the pressure to dispose of surplus military aircraft increased. The reality was unavoidable. Most of these planes were not simply being stored, but were quickly becoming obsolete. The rise of newer, more advanced aircraft, such as the jet-powered fighters and bombers that were coming off assembly lines in the 1950s, further rendered many older models redundant. While many of the aircraft still had salvageable parts, the growing cost of preserving them, combined with the changing nature of warfare, made their continued storage increasingly untenable. In the United States, the government began dismantling many of these aircraft. By the mid-1950s, large numbers of planes were sent to the scrapper's yard, where they were disassembled and their parts recycled. This process was not simple. The sheer volume of aircraft meant that massive amounts of labor were required to break them down, and the cost of processing them was high. The resources that could be salvaged, mainly metals like aluminum and steel, were valuable, but the labor involved made this a lengthy and costly process. Aircraft that had cost tens of thousands of dollars to build were being sold for only a fraction of that price, with parts often stripped for reuse in other applications or to simply recover the value of the raw materials. Even as this process unfolded, the broader economic pressures surrounding these aircraft could not be ignored. The cost of continued maintenance and storage grew more burdensome as the years passed. By 1949, the United States had spent approximately $5 million just to store surplus aircraft, an amount that was rapidly growing. Aircraft graveyards that had once been seen as a temporary solution became permanent fixtures of the landscape, but it was clear that they could not remain so indefinitely. In parallel with this, a global market for scrap metal and surplus military equipment began to emerge. Aircraft that had been deemed unnecessary by the U.S. military were now being sold to other nations, often for pennies on the dollar. These countries, eager to build or bolster their own air forces, purchased older models, some of which had seen little use during the war. For some, it was the only affordable way to acquire modern aircraft, albeit of a previous generation. Other countries turned to these surplus planes for repurposing, adapting them for civilian use, such as crop dusting or passenger transport, albeit often with limited success. The U.S. Air Force began taking stock of its own needs in the early 1950s, and in some cases, aircraft were retained in service for specialized purposes, such as reconnaissance or training. For example, some of the B-17s and B-24s found new life as firebombers in the American West. Others, like the P-51 Mustangs, were used in air races or sold to private collectors who maintained them as rare vintage aircraft. Still, the disposal of aircraft from the wartime era continued to unfold in a piecemeal fashion, with some aircraft remaining in storage, others being disassembled for parts, and others sold or given away for secondary uses. The process was slow, uneven, and reflective of the uncertainty that followed the war. The decisions surrounding these planes were not simply a matter of clearing out old equipment. They represented a broader transition in global geopolitics and technological advancement. The story of these aircraft graveyards was not just about the planes themselves but also about the global shifts that were occurring in the immediate post-war years. As the early 1950s drew to a close, aircraft from the war years were no longer seen as valuable military assets. They were increasingly viewed as relics of a past that no longer held relevance in the New World Order. The question that remained was whether any part of these aircraft could be salvaged or repurposed in a world that was increasingly focused on newer technologies and a changing strategic landscape. The quiet desert airfields and sprawling storage lots began to fill with planes that had no real future, their fates uncertain. Aircraft that had once filled the skies with the sounds of battle now stood motionless, destined to be dismantled, abandoned, or left to slowly fade away in the heat of the desert sun. These graveyards would not just become monuments to the war they had fought, but to a world that had no place for them anymore. The post-war fate of Allied aircraft graveyards unfolded across the 1950s and into the 1960s, as the once bustling airfields now filled with rows of obsolete, silent planes. The story of their disposal was as much about the evolving demands of the military as it was about economic pressures, shifting global dynamics, and the changing face of technology. As new military needs arose, these aircraft, once symbols of victory, became increasingly irrelevant, caught between the push to modernize and the constraints of a world struggling to recover from a devastating war. In the early 1950s, the U.S. government began a systematic process of eliminating the surplus aircraft that had been stored in vast desert depots across the country. The scale of the task was staggering, as there were thousands of planes scattered across these aircraft boneyards, as they became known. The largest of these sites was located at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, Arizona, where, by 1955, over 4,000 aircraft were stored, many of them never flown in combat. The need to clear these sites intensified as military priorities shifted toward the new jet era, and maintaining outdated piston-engine planes became a luxury the government could no longer afford. One of the first decisions made in this process was the classification of which aircraft would be scrapped and which might be kept for secondary uses. In some cases, aircraft that were seen as having potential for future conflict were retained for storage, but these cases were becoming fewer as new military technologies were developed. Most planes were dismantled, the valuable parts salvaged, and the remains either sold for scrap or simply abandoned. The sheer volume of aircraft meant that this process was not swift. By the mid-1950s, a significant portion of the U.S. Air Force's budget was still being consumed by the maintenance of these surplus aircraft, with no real end in sight. The dismantling process itself was a highly organized effort. It was not simply a matter of dragging planes to a scrapyard. These planes were systematically stripped of their engines, landing gear, and other usable components. In many cases, this labor-intensive process required crews to dismantle thousands of planes, with each one taking hours or even days to break down. Afterward, the parts were either sold to other sectors or melted down for their raw materials. These materials, especially aluminum, were valuable in the post-war economy, which was now shifting its focus to civilian production. Yet, despite the value of these metals, the effort to process the planes was often not cost-effective in the face of the ongoing pressure to dispose of them quickly. At the same time, the American public became increasingly aware of the aircraft graveyards, particularly after the first images of the vast depots appeared in the media. The sight of so many warplanes, sitting idle, unable to serve any purpose, seemed to embody the end of an era. It was a stark contrast to the days of intense production and the energy of wartime industry. However, as public interest grew, some aircraft were salvaged for use in private hands. Vintage warplanes like the P-51 Mustang or the B-17 Flying Fortress were sold off to collectors or aviation enthusiasts, who restored them and kept them as artifacts of history. Many were flown at air shows or placed in museums, where they became living reminders of a world now gone. Yet for every aircraft that found a second life in the hands of collectors, there were hundreds more that were either destroyed or left to rot in the desert sun. The vast desert fields, once filled with the sounds of roaring engines, now stood silent, the planes slowly deteriorating under the harsh conditions. With little to no financial incentive to preserve them, the fate of these aircraft seemed inevitable. While the survivors were celebrated, the larger truth remained that for every plane that escaped the graveyard, there were countless others that simply disappeared into the dust. During this time, the growing Cold War tensions began to influence decisions surrounding military aircraft. The United States was faced with the need to rapidly scale up its nuclear capabilities and jet forces, which further diminished the relevance of the older aircraft in storage. The rise of jet propulsion meant that piston-engine aircraft such as the B-17, B-24, and P-51 were no longer suitable for the modern battlefield. In the face of the Soviet Union's growing influence and the proliferation of nuclear weapons, the military's focus had to be on speed, power, and efficiency. Aircraft from the war era were no longer capable of matching the new strategic needs of the post-war world. As the decade progressed, a few of the wartime aircraft found themselves put to unusual uses. Some were converted into firebombers to fight wildfires in the American West. The B-17 Flying Fortress, for instance, which had once dropped bombs over Europe, was repurposed as a firefighting aircraft, dropping retardant on massive forest fires. In other cases, surplus planes were used as targets in gunnery training for the next generation of pilots. These repurposed aircraft, however, were a tiny fraction of the vast fleet that had once dominated the skies. By the 1960s, the situation had shifted entirely. As military needs further evolved, and the United States and its allies began to see the vast stockpiles of wartime aircraft as nothing more than a liability, the final efforts to clear the boneyards took place. The planes that had once been built in massive factories, sometimes at the rate of several per day, were now left to decay in the harsh desert air. The scrap metal industry had moved on, the need for surplus parts had dried up, and the cost of maintaining these aircraft for any secondary purpose had long since outweighed any potential return. It was at this point that the final phase of aircraft disposal took place. Large sections of these graveyards, once teeming with planes, were now cleared, the aircraft reduced to metal husks. Some were melted down and reprocessed into new materials. Others were simply abandoned in forgotten corners of the desert. The process was efficient but stark. It marked the final chapter of these aircraft, most of which had flown to battle in distant skies, only to be left to rot, forgotten by history. Yet, despite the overwhelming tide of aircraft being lost to time, the legacy of the aircraft graveyards endured. For years, the United States, through the National Museum of the United States Air Force and other institutions, sought to preserve some of the remaining aircraft. Many of these planes, although they had seen no further combat, had become historical artifacts. The need to commemorate and remember the planes that had once been so vital to the war effort grew, and a few aircraft found new homes in museums around the world, where they would serve as monuments to the technological feats of the war and the complexities of the post-war transition.